Logistics.
And there we are. We're recording. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Sustainiacs. I'm the Sustainiac every time we do this show, and the other one always changes. But here's the other one this time. It's Rob Wadsworth. Or I'm sorry, man, I screwed that up. Watersworth. That's
It's without the S.
That's wrong too. It's Waterworth. There's no S in there at all, is there, Rob?
No, that's all good.
No,
though.
there isn't. There's only one S in this room, and I know who it is. Anyways, I do know that you are co-founder and chief science and innovation officer at FLINTpro. That is true, correct?
That is true, yes.
There's also no S in FLINTpro.
That's true.
Hey, welcome to the show, my friend. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for the invite. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
And that intro, you can't buy that type of intro.
No, that's right. Exactly. That's perfect.
See, the beautiful thing is I learned from a very, very good podcaster and good friend of mine. His name is Tim Dooner. That natural discovery is the key, right? So, scripted podcasts and stuff don't work. It also makes for good humor sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone needs a laugh into all of this stuff, don't you?
Yeah, they do. They absolutely do. My God, who is he actually interviewing? Is his name Rob or Ron or Joe or what's his last name? It is Rob Waterworth. You heard me right. Everybody's going, holy crap, not Rob. He's awesome. Where are you at, Rob?
Oh, I'm down in Canberra in Australia. So it's a pleasant, early, very cold morning here.
Ah, yeah, very cool. I was talking to somebody this morning and I thought he was in Australia. He was actually in Johannesburg.
Right.
But last time I talked to him, he was in Australia. And the time I talked to him before that, he was in Bangladesh. And sustainability stuff. They're doing, this guy happens to work for a company that does pyrolysis on severely contaminated plastics, turns it into hydrogen gas, which they actually capture, and number 2 diesel.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, pretty cool stuff. Really cool stuff. I heard you were into like sustainability and stuff, right? What do you do, my friend?
Yeah, look, I've been working around it for a while now. So I've been 25 years or so working in land sector sustainability, primarily about how do you actually assess what's sustainable. And if it's not, then how do you actually change your practices to make it sustainable? So it's been a long journey.
Let's hear your journey. I'm sorry. I get so interested in what people say that I want to go down this rabbit hole and I don't let them say. Tell us your journey into this. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Look, like a lot of people, I started out in forestry actually. Give my age away a bit, back in the 90s, but very quickly moved into carbon accounting in the land sector. So how do you estimate the amount of carbon in trees and debris and soil, but also the impacts of using products, bioenergy, all of those things. People, when they talk about the land sector, forget that basically you're touching the land sector every single day, everything you do. Picking up the guitar you've got there, it's obviously made of wood. You're eating your breakfast.
Swamp ash.
All connected to the land sector. So really, really interesting challenges. And I, in the 2000s, worked a lot on deforestation, particularly in Australia early on, but then moved out and started looking at that more globally. Then after leaving government, started FLINTpro, really trying to take all that experience of how do you design and build frameworks that allow you to actually assess the land that you're impacting and how do you make better decisions on it. I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, so FLINTpro, and that's interesting. But FLINTpro, you talk about framework. You're talking about software and to be able to calculate impacts or predict impacts, predictive analytics, et cetera, that type of stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. We're a bit different to other groups. What we are is effectively an integration engine. So the best way to think about the land sector is that there's no silver bullet in the land sector. You're never going to be able to get the data you need just from satellites or just from models or just from ground samples or just from talking to farmers or foresters. all of those have a place, but then they can't do it all. So what we do is we actually integrate all of those data streams in a coherent way to then produce outputs that's useful. So you need the satellites to
Okay.
track the land, you need the models to estimate carbon flows, you need statistical information to estimate at regional levels, what people are managing, how are people growing their wheat or their barley or their trees. All of those pieces of information we drag together, and that puts us in a bit of a different space to most of the other companies working in these areas. Most of the other companies, and they're fantastic companies, don't get me wrong, we couldn't exist without them, are doing those other pieces. Like they're taking satellite data and turning it into maps of forest, and then we're taking those maps and then we're turning them into products for carbon accounting and for biodiversity and other metrics. It's a really
Gotcha.
fascinating space.
So, I can guess a lot of the motivation for what you're doing here just based on the fact that from Australia. I've never been, but I understand there's a deep connection between the environment, the land, et cetera, and Australians, much more so than in many other countries. Certainly in most parts of the United States, where we have huge populations that probably never saw an actual tree. It seems, most of the United States is considered flyover country for for the major population. But so how and why FLINTpro? What was the motivation to do this? Was it, did you see something lacking and see an economic or business opportunity, or was there a mission based, this needs to be done in order to improve our impacts on the environment? What was that spark that brought
Look,
you in there?
it was really the second one to start with. It was very mission based. So when we'd left government, we were actually doing a lot of work at the time with the Clinton Foundation, trying to work
Okay,
with developing countries. Because remember, 10 years ago, a lot of corporates weren't really focusing on land sector carbon, and climate change wasn't as big an issue as it is now. It's not as ingrained in the population.
sure.
So we were really trying to work with governments to help them. How do you actually figure out what's happening on the land, and how do you set policies and support processes and programs? And the inspiration behind it really was that we had all of these lessons, and we made plenty of mistakes building all of the Australian systems. And we wanted to bring all of those lessons and experience of building those first generation tools here and actually be able to allow others to use those. So we really started this out as okay, can we take all of that experience, partner up with other countries, and start developing large open source platforms and systems to support people to make better decisions? What really happened then halfway through that journey, of course, was suddenly the corporate sector really started getting interested, and people started needing to think about, well, if I'm having these products, what's the emissions associated with my Mars bar or with my various other foodstuffs or products? And so that then brought us in to say, well, we need to take that on as well, because that's really where the impact is going to be. So we just used the same technology, we just adjusted it slightly and turned it into rather than building large systems that you install on government computers, turning it into a software as a service system that anyone can access anywhere in the world.
Gotcha. So, we're talking about nature. We're talking about nature data, right? And you're talking
Yes.
about like a Mars bar, right? I heard you say a Mars bar, right? Which is interesting because you would think of CPG and all you should worry about is the foil packaging, but that's not the case. So, what is? Let's just use that, or whatever, whoever you wish. You don't have to
Yeah.
stick to that exact
Yeah.
example. It's just there because you mentioned it, and I love Mars bars,
Yeah.
by the
Me
way.
too.
But yeah, but and I've been to Mars, Pennsylvania, but nature data and Mars bars don't necessarily. Most people wouldn't connect the two. What is nature data first,
Yep.
and why is it important? And why would it be important to somebody who just makes candy bars?
Yeah. So, I mean, nature data is a fascinating thing because you could define it in so many different ways. But really, the way I like to define it uh, is actually bringing it more to nature information. So, information on, sorry, information
Not
on
a problem.
when we when we do something, when we grow a crop, when we grow a tree, when we harvest those things, when we turn them into things, what's the impact of that on the environment? There's so many processes going on. So how are we impacting that? And it's not just carbon, it's biodiversity, it's water, it's soil health. There's lots of things going on under this nature banner that you really need to think
Mm,
about and assess. So that's where we come up from nature information. And you're right, most people traditionally especially when you come with climate change, we're really thinking much more around what are the fossil fuel emissions? Have I used energy from a
Yeah.
coal-fired power station? What were the trucks running
Yeah.
on? How
Scopes
far did the
one,
trucks
twos, and
drive?
threes, right? Yeah. One, two, three scopes. That's it,
That's
is
right.
what people mostly think
Exactly.
of.
Really sort of thinking about that. But especially with a lot of the commodities now being grown in sort of countries in across Southeast Asia, and that a lot of that has been driven deforestation. The oil palm is a good example, soy, others. The impact of a Mars bar or the impact of a candy bar, let's not pick on Mars bars because there's hundreds of different ones.
Yeah.
They're
Well,
all
I mean,
using
they
these
are
products.
tasty. I'm going to say that. They
Exactly,
are
that's right.
tasty. So we'll give them that plug.
And I won't stand up here because otherwise you'd see I may have eaten too many of them over the years.
I thought maybe it was too early for you to have pants on. I was going to say, let's keep it PG, my friend.
Yeah,
Come on.
exactly. And that realization now is it's really just coming through. So have been past efforts on deforestation in particular, but really bringing into this, how do we start really assessing the impact of everything that we're doing, and so that we can then drive positive change. And I think that's the most interesting part of nature data these days and nature information is this big shift in the last few years from just reporting what's happened and what you may have done to, well, that's great, but how do you do better? And that's really where you need these systems to start saying, well, it's nice that we know what's happened, but unless we can change the future for the better, that's almost irrelevant. So it's
Yeah,
really
and it
that's
does
an
it get
exciting piece.
into it gets it does it get into validating impacts? Like you look and you see the impact of this land, and you might obviously to you it's this happened because of X, Y, and Z. But then when you dig into that data, it's not necessarily the truth, right? I mean, does
No,
it go through that validation of what you're trying to accomplish or have already accomplished, let's say?
yeah, definitely, that's right, and helps you attribute. That's the key piece that you're saying. Like, you need to be able to
Yeah,
attribute, that this happened because of this, and therefore here was our impact, and that can get very tricky, especially in places where traditionally there hasn't been much data collection, and there hasn't really
right.
been a sort of a focused analysis. It's very much been about, can we increase production, and so that's sort of a bit of a
Mm.
shift for everybody. But that's been greatly helped by technologies like ours and other companies that are able to come in and look remotely and model a lot of these processes to get a good starting point, and then start thinking about, now let's start engaging with these groups to collect better and better data on the ground.
Gotcha. And so your data would be it would be quite useful, I would think, in many aspects, but also in regulatory environments, but also in um, compliance as well, right? So, for instance, some of the latest legislation out of California here in the United States was around voluntary carbon impacts
Yes.
and how there are specific rules on what you can and cannot say for sure, but you have to have specific evidence behind those because of cited, so-called scams or nefarious activities behind carbon credits, et cetera. Is that a use for what your data does as well to validate that type of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. It goes from end to end across all of these things. So one of the most fascinating parts of the market now is this big drive on a number of new regulations, both state, national, but even regional. And probably the big one would be the European Union's deforestation
Yeah,
regulations.
sure.
And that's
Yeah,
just such a classic example of where people have made lots of voluntary commitments on avoiding deforestation for the last 10 to 15 years. Those have largely failed. And the EU's come in and put in place some regulations. Those regulations focus on, if your product contains one of 7 commodities, things like, does it contain oil palm? Does it contain soy, beef, wood, all of these other these key
yeah,
commodities? Then how do you prove that? So you need to show that that's not coming from land that's been deforested. So you've got a couple of components there. You need to be able to have a risk profile of, well, are we at risk of this to start with? And if we are at risk, how do we make sure we're going to comply? Because in a few years' time, the financial penalties for that could be absolutely enormous. So that's a key piece. But you've also then got a lot of these other groups that are reaching these voluntary commitments. So they're saying, we commit to be net zero by a set year, or we are committing to, be nature positive by 2040 or something like that. They're also now in this place of, well, you make the commitment, but how do you make sure you actually know where you're starting from and where you're going to?
Mm,
And that's the
mm.
really big
Yeah.
challenge in the next few years. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, that will be one of the bigger challenges. The regulation piece is just going to have to happen, and that's fantastic. But it's that next step of how do you meet those regulations and then hopefully realize this is a huge net benefit to you and the company. How do we actually step that forward to take even further actions beyond the regulations?
Yeah, and I see what you're doing. The data that you have there is this ability or an enabler, if you will, for companies to actually make those voluntary commitments, right? Because
Yes.
that's a dangerous prospect for a company, especially if it's a publicly traded company, to voluntarily say, "Hey, we're going to hit these." I can see a lot of shareholders going, "Why are you volunteering this unless you have to?" Right? Because you're putting the value of those stocks and to your shareholders at risk, right?
Yeah, look, exactly. And it's actually a pattern that we've seen a lot over the last 20, 25 years of various commitments. And voluntary commitments they're important and they are extremely useful. One of the challenges is often they get made with very limited information. Often on a
Yeah.
there's an issue, they make a voluntary commitment that, and it's only after the commitment that people start assessing, well, where are we? What can we achieve? And then they
Yeah.
suddenly realize it's super hard and okay, well, that's a problem. How do we start slowly backing out of these commitments or start trying to change the commitment to something that's actually achievable? And what I'd love to see is getting us to a point where you're making a commitment that's certainly a stretch goal. You don't want to make undercommit and do it so it's so simple that you don't have to do anything, but having that clear
Yeah.
pathway so the executive have a really yes, look, we can achieve this, we can commit to this, and we can achieve it if we push this hard. I think that's, and this has happened not just across corporates. You only need to look at the commitments made for emissions reductions under the Kyoto Protocol, things like that. Everyone made these strong
Sure.
emissions targets. Nearly everyone failed at reaching them. So it's
Yeah,
great to, how do you reach them?
but we need to set goals that we're in danger of failing. Yeah, I mean,
Yes,
just it's not a failure if you don't reach them.
no,
The
that's right.
failure is not setting a goal or trying because of fear of failure, right? I mean, I sound like I'm a 70s sitcom trying to but I mean, but it's true, right? So the data and the service that you provide can do that. Can say, look, this is what we did achieve. Because many times that fear of setting that commitment and going forward is that if you so-called fail, don't reach that target, even if you're 99% of the way there, somehow your image is more tarnished than if you never tried
Yeah,
and make zero impact, right?
and that's a really big problem in this space. And then because people have to back away from some of those voluntary commitments, they get nervous about making the next one instead of saying, "Look,
Yeah,
we really put the effort in here, and it was much harder than we thought." And to be honest, this is the challenge in these spaces. This stuff is hard. We're changing not just our practices, but you're changing the social construct, the way people think about the way they've done things for 20, 30, 40 years. How do you get those mindset changes that help drive that sustainability process well into the future, not just the short-term goals? And I think that's the most interesting part in the nature space is that the decisions being made on these targets and the push down from the top can really help there because that's changing the way the market and what the market is willing to accept. And when you bring in what corporates are saying, when you bring in what social and what the society wants, then suddenly you can start seeing those changes occur.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when we start talking about companies and land in particular, what people mostly think of when you say nature and environment, they think about the land.
Yeah.
Um, how do there's I mean it's impossible to ask the question how do companies how should or what should companies know about their land because you see it all over the place, right? I mean, even an apartment building in specific areas, and certainly in the area I live here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, has to worry about the land because the first thing that's built is a retention pond.
Yeah.
Okay. And before that even goes up are the little black fences to keep silt and stuff from getting into the water table, et cetera, which it's a nice idea, but they really look like they're just there to sell black plastic fences because they don't do a darn thing. I mean, there's by this first week they're up, half of it's gone and stuff like that. But regardless, I mean, everybody has to worry about their land, but we're talking about something much deeper here, right? when you start talking about land and that nature. Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, maybe there's a range in my mind, and I'm thinking of when you start saying, okay, we're going to start using biofuels. Well, what does that do to land and agriculture and food production, et cetera, and all that other kind of stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And these are some of the really big questions that are coming up for people all the time. Is a biofuel is actually a really good example. It can be quite controversial, although it's probably and will be a key piece of the climate solution moving forward. So,
Listen, I was talking, just to interrupt you real quick on that exact point. Okay. I was talking to a logistics company, a very, very large logistics company, multinational, worldwide, very large, 50 million gallons of fuel a month just in the States is what they use.
yeah,
24% of it is renewable or biodiesel. That's a
it's
big number.
it's huge numbers, and I think there are things in there that you need to realize that people that don't make a lot of sense to people as well. So, firstly, are you growing crops purely for bioenergy, or are you using waste
Yeah.
residues? Yeah, that's one of the very first questions that comes up. And are those if it is waste residues, is it the value of the waste residues that's changing the way you're managing your land? And are you changing that for the positive or negative? There's so many little pushes and drivers inside that system that make things really difficult to understand in a really clear way without good information. That's the second piece of that, of course, comes to what's the efficiency of doing all of these things. And then more importantly, how much land would you even need? And 50,000 gallons, as you mentioned, that is a lot of fuel. Is a good way.
50 million. 50
50
million.
million. Yeah, that is an enormous amount of fuel. And
Yeah,
so,
it's one company in a month.
yeah, like that if you went on, we're going to try to source all of that from land, you would notice that is a huge area of land. Land and trees and crops all have they're limited by photosynthesis. You can't just go, can we please have 30% more, because
Yeah.
there are all
Yeah.
these
Last I checked. Yeah.
processes. Yeah, it would be, yes, there's efforts at how you can make them more efficient, but it's not going to change the world on that piece alone. So it's a really interesting space. The other part with the land sector that is just how many touch points people have on it. So most people, there's the direct touch point, the farmer themselves working on the land, but then that you've got all of these other people. So you've got banks, for example, who are lending money to those farmers, who are saying, well, we
Mm.
effectively have ownership of that land in some ways, or ownership of the emissions, because we're providing the finance for how these farmers are
Mm.
operating. So then they have to think about
Ownership or liability?
both in some ways, depending on how they
Yeah.
view it as a
Okay.
mortgage. And the liability piece
Right.
comes in as well, especially around climate change, where you're seeing a number of these groups looking, they're putting maybe a 20-year loan out on a farm. Well, what if
Yeah.
rainfall drops by 30% with climate change? Will that farm be
Rain
able to
insurance.
continue to produce? Will they ever be able to pay that loan back, or is it just going to end up as a bad loan on your books? So many
Mm.
complexities sitting inside these systems to think about. And then how do you actually support better practices? So you see, for example, going back to banks, a number of banks and also some large agribusinesses and others saying, look, we'll take a little bit off your loan, a percentage point, half a percentage point off your loan, if you do some green practices that help us meet our targets and your targets. Or corporates saying, well, look, we'll pay you a little bit more for the product if you meet these certain things that reduce emissions or protect some land for biodiversity. So you're seeing these multiple drivers, but they're not necessarily coming from the landowners themselves. They're coming from all of these other sectors that are starting to focus on this.
I get it. I get it. Yeah. As you're talking about that, we talk about farmers and energy extraction from biomass, et cetera. Right. And there's a lot of other pressures that are there. There's Hemspan up there over in the UK that's building or making building materials, et cetera, out
Yep.
of hemp and which is a really, really a good bioproduct from the sense of land regeneration, et cetera, as far as, growing it after soybeans or whatever, crop rotation, the whole thing and stuff like that. So it's a great, it's a weed, no pun intended. uh, but it is right. And it's very nutritional for the ground, et cetera. So it's excellent. But to change over all of our insulative, compounds to hemp would require massive amounts of land, which can be used for other things and need to be used for everything. Obviously, the world population is growing, and you need to feed the people as well.
Yes.
How does this move? How do you pull this into, say, mining? Right? I mean, your data and your usage there, all the way from a car battery manufacturer or a cell phone manufacturer, or a Verizon, for instance, not to pick on another company, but why not? Um, the cell phone manufacturers of their phones, right, have to have rare earth minerals and mining, right? So this is a use case there as well, correct?
Definitely, and we we have done a fair bit of work with mining companies over the years, really looking at what's the impact across the top of the land, especially when you're clearing that land for mining, the more open cut style mines. And it's not just that. What about when you rehabilitate it? What about when you put the soils back and you start replanting the trees? The other part as well is a lot of these mining companies do actually hold very large areas of land that they're not using at the moment. So they've got
Mm,
all these effectively areas that they'll say, well, we will use these at some point. How do you manage those better as well across the space? I think one of the points that you made on the hemp, though, is one of the most interesting aspects of the land sector, especially around climate change, is how products themselves coming from the land sector, it's less about the carbon on the land, but it's the reduced emissions that they can lead to. So you look at something like
yeah.
timber, the carbon, yes, timber stores carbon, and that is an important component of when we build with carbon. You can see that in the mass timber building movement, especially across Canada and Europe, where you see a lot of people starting to build high rises with engineered wood products. But the
Yeah.
huge saving in those products isn't from the carbon in the wood, it's actually from not using steel and concrete. When you start replacing those extremely energy intensive products as much as possible, you can't replace them completely, obviously, but as you move to something like a wood or an engineered product made from other food or fiber products, then suddenly there's a huge impact on needing much, much less of those other materials, which can probably have a bigger impact in many ways than the trees standing in the ground. And so you have this really interesting
Mm,
tension across the space as well around how far along that do you want to go. We need to protect all of these trees. Don't need to protect all of them. We need to look after the land and manage those trees sustainably, but we also need more timber. And this comes to your point, the same with food. We need to protect all of these areas of forest in developing countries and look after them before they all get cleared, but we need to feed the population. So, and the population's
yeah.
growing. So, how do you make those changes in increased efficiency, better genetics, better protection? It all has to come together. It's not just one thing. It's going to be the science, it's going to be the social side, it's going to be government policy, it's going to be corporate drivers. All of these things are influencing how we do things. And if we don't get those right in one package, then typically something goes wrong. And that's one of the most fascinating parts of the land sector is getting that information to all of those players so that they all are on a common field and understand the challenge that they're seeing.
That is really interesting. And, we talk about companies being able to understand their impact on the land, on nature, et cetera, through this and predictive analytics and validation, and et cetera, um, and able to, compliance factors. How do we comply with this new, the EU carbon tax credit, or in all these different EPR legislations, et cetera, whatever it happens to be, CARB, you name it. Um, I wonder about the use of this data to influence the the writing and creation of that legislation. Is that something you've run across? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. Look, we've got a lot of experience of that, having worked in government in Australia, and really building those data sets up and then being able to inform people around, well, here's the problems that you're seeing. And it's one of the most exciting parts in the land information environment, or in many ways, has been this opening up of, in particular, the remote sensing data, the satellite data, into the public
Mm,
realm. So if you think 20 years ago, getting Landsat, which was a fairly standard satellite product, about a 30-meter resolution, the USA has been flying that in different forms since 1972. Quite a remarkable time
mm,
series, and in particular, very densely since 1984. So it actually goes back a long way, this data. And in the 2000s, to
mm,
access that, you had to, you know, go to effectively a government agency, your government agency where you were, it would cost you $600 for a block of data. It would get sent to you on a DVD. It just inaccessible. So very, very difficult for anyone to really see, well, what's going on in the land. By 2010, 2012, when the US government in particular drove forward and said, a little bit like the GPS, taking this differential selection off the GPS, when they opened up this Landsat archive and said, we're just going to make all of this free for everybody now because we think it's important, that just completely changed the landscape, because suddenly people could start analysing areas very, very quickly and start saying, that's not very good. And that's really flipped people's minds, because you can now see the impact, not just that we're having now, but you can see the impact of what we were doing in the 90s and the 80s and how you can actually change that. And that's an extremely powerful story. I think that's one of the most interesting bits of what we're seeing now, is more and more of that data is coming out. We're getting better and better data every day. And so you're getting more and more transparency, which is really helping that discussion piece that simply didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah, because we all know governments can set mandates and stuff that are intended well, but have negative impacts because of lack of data. I mean, they're not the experts on everything, right? And they need private sector people like you to educate them on these decisions that they're going to make and validate X plus Y equals Z. The cause and effect of different things is not always what it initially appears, right? And understanding that is incredibly important. Incredibly important.
And it's very easy to make bad decisions if you're not tracking it, and then not realize until it's too late that you'd made a bad decision. And this is a really problematic space for that. The best example, again, when I started working in this back in the early 2000s, Australia had a lot of deforestation in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s. But the problem was no one knew where it was. So everyone knew it was big, and everyone knew it was probably in Queensland and New South Wales, but no one really knew where and what farms. And so it wasn't until there was a government program that came and said, no, we actually have to map this now. This is actually important, that they could actually say, well, we can actually see the trends and the problems. And it's a really powerful change. And so I think that's, as you were pointing out, it's an absolutely key piece. If you can't get that understanding in early, then it's very easy just to make knee-jerk reactions. And that challenge that I'm sure you've heard from plenty of people on this, of the word just in the sustainability space, is probably the word I hate the most. It's, we just need to do this. And you go, well, no, it's very, very difficult. If we just needed to do it, we probably would have done it, and we probably would have got it right. So how do you make sure that we take the word or make it possible that we can say we can just do this, but we need the information behind it?
Yeah. You need accessibility, you need efficient infrastructure set up, and you need the technology to do it, and you need the education to get the people the participation. But without all the data and what you're doing, none of those things can happen. It's impossible to create effective accessibility and infrastructure on purpose, I should say, without this data. You can accidentally do it. Yes. But that's not a good way to do things. Right? I'm not saying it's impossible. It is possible, but accidentally doing it, it's better to be lucky than good sometimes. But I think in this point, we probably should understand what we're doing before we do it, right?
Oh, exactly. And it's fascinating when you talk to a lot of policymakers and others, executives working in sustainability. There is this interesting tension between scientists and those groups, because scientists want everything to be super accurate. Oh, it needs to be 95% accurate and all of these things. And we can't do anything until we've got these tight error bounds around something. But then you've got the other corporate people who say, look, we're just guessing at the moment. So when we make a decision on something, we're about 50-50. And if you can get us to 70-30, that is a huge increase in our sustainability. Sure. And yes, we'll still make some mistakes. And yes, we'll still won't put things in the exact right spots. But we're going to be a lot better. And then hopefully next year we get to 75 and 77 and 80, and we can start stepping that up. And this is one of the most interesting challenges in this space, is there's a lot of great scientists who are extremely dedicated and want to get to this accuracy. And we need those people working on that. It's absolutely vital, because that's the only way we're ever going to improve. But we also just need to take with what we've got and go, we can just make better decisions right now with what we've got. And they won't all be perfect, but they'll be a lot better than where we are. And so trying to get that continuous improvement through is one of the most exciting parts of working in this. Actually, I love it because I get to work with the high level scientists working on the really tough stuff and coming down to what's the actual challenge that we're trying to solve so that we can use whatever we can to get to that point.
So, and those are all great points. And one of the things that you said is, as we're building, if you can get us to the 70-30 surety, we can go there and hopefully we can get to 77 and 80 and 95, et cetera, and grow as we move. That implies that the solutions that you're putting together are living, breathing, flexible, dynamic solutions, and it requires data to be able to utilize that attribute or to get the benefit from that attribute, right? As you move forward.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts of my job that I love is the system itself runs globally. We can run anywhere in the world instantly. But the quality of that result depends on the quality of the input data that we've got. Now, some people just need a rough number, and that's probably going to be okay. But if you need a much more accurate number for your area, then we're not locked to like a lot of other groups to saying, well, that's unlucky. This is all we do. We can say, that's great. Now let's look at the inputs that you need. Here's where the most uncertainty is coming from. It might be your maps of forest aren't very good, or your models of carbon being sequestered, the tree growth, for example, the crop growth, or the soil carbon models aren't very good for this region. We can work with you to say, for bang for buck, if we can get you better data, we can use some of our remote sensing partners, we can bring in better data and we can rerun the system. And now you'll have a more accurate number. And so you can basically have that full power of, we need it to be this good. Okay, well, given that, here's what you need to change to get to that good. And so that's really trying to provide that end-to-end system of, you can get started today, which everyone needs to do, and just get going. But as you need to improve, we can help you all the way through that chain to the very end where you've got exactly what you need. Because some of these things will take a couple of years. If you're in a complex space and the data's not there, then you need to figure out how you're going to step through that process, but you still need a number today. And that's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and you've got to go through the plan, do, check, act cycle. You can't wait
Exactly.
for greatness, like we said before. And we've really got to educate a lot of the or a good portion of the public to understand that there's going to be failures, and it doesn't mean that they were nefarious and they need to be sued. That kills progress, right? I mean, it kills progress when if you fail, you get sued, and because it decreases the desire to try.
Exactly. And you see that across a lot of areas. It's certainly happened a lot before where people have had a really, really good effort. It hasn't worked out. And as you said, and that pushes not just that company from stopping trying, it stops the other companies in the industry. There's a couple of, the oil and gas industry is a very good example of that. There's been a couple of companies over the last 25 years, the large oil and gas producers, who've put their necks out ahead for a little while and said, look, we're going to start pushing harder on solar and we're going to try to be more sustainable and we're going to do these things. And they push out. Yeah. What typically happens is they then become a bit of a focal point for people to say, well, you haven't done enough and you're not good enough. They're not criticizing all the other companies sitting back, the ones that have come out. And then eventually they realize that they're just on a hiding to nothing. They're just getting kicked and kicked and kicked. And they go, well, we'll just come back here and we'll just go back to where everyone else is. And that's a really disappointing outcome because it hasn't, it's had the exact opposite impact of what we want, which is these people have really tried to push out. They've realized it's hard. They get so much criticism, it's not worthwhile. So that you go back. And you go back to your core principles of we're this type of company and this is what we do. So
it stifles innovation and it stunts growth. And that's not what we need right now. We need to go and try multiple ideas and take some chances. And the old cliche, we need to fail fast if that's what it's going to be, right? But exactly. But promote that those attempts and that nascent technologies and try and move. I think have we missed a use case? I don't know. I mean, we could talk about NASA going to Mars and mining the moon and stuff like that if you'd like, but so the question I have is this: it's not really along the lines of it kind of is. There's resources out there and there's free resources that you can go out there. Like I can go to the EPA and get an interactive map and say, okay, I want to see by zip code across the United States and I can see um, aluminum cans, right? I can look at aluminum cans, and it can tell me basically by county what the potential for recycling is there based on consumption and recycling rates, and give me all these other kind of. And in my previous life, I was a data aggregator for logistics, and all this disparate data out there that you could go and get yourself. And some of it was free. Now, a lot of it was proprietary, and we signed contracts and stuff like that because we saw the value in this, and we were helping logistics companies, et cetera, worldwide move their goods. And obviously, you can see the benefit of that coming out of COVID. It's very important, and it's really important now for emissions in Scope 3, particularly,
Yeah.
to understand where your inventory and movement is and what the potential pitfalls and hurdles are. It is a great asset. Is that part of the value in what you're doing at FLINTpro, is the aggregation and then being able to consume, because data is data and data is garbage
Yeah,
unless you know what the hell to do with it, right? You've
exactly.
got to be able to do with it, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly, and that's one of the key pieces. So, some of our products like the FLINTpro Reg IQ product that we've just released, really good example where what you need is you need to not know the emissions from your area. That's helpful. This area of farm had this much emissions or this much removals, but the actual question is for how much production. So, for every ton
Yeah.
of palm oil I produced, what was the emissions profile from this area as opposed to this area? How do I change my sourcing processes so that I can get a lower amount of emissions? Now, they're two very different questions. How much emissions came from that land? What's actually the emissions intensity of my products so that I can try to reduce those across my portfolio and make those decisions around where else do I go? The point that you've
Yeah.
made there, especially with the postcode one, is a classic example of benchmarking that we work on a lot with products like our insights and advanced analytics pieces, which are, here's my area. How am I performing against everyone else in this area? Are my
Mm.
practices better or worse? Am I having more emissions or fewer emissions? And this to me is those really interesting pieces of being able to run very large areas quickly, so that you can say, well, here's the average for a region. Now, where do you fit in that? And if you are below that, well, why are you below that average? Why aren't you lifting the entire process? And hopefully,
Mm.
by giving that information, you're slowly raising the bar, and that benchmark gets better and better and better through time. So it's not just about being able to run one specific area. It's going to be about how do you actually analyze all the areas around that as well, be it at a postcode level
Mm.
or anywhere else. And that's a fascinating challenge and something we've done a lot of work on and pushed into, again, a bit into Reg IQ and very much into the advanced analytics platforms.
Yeah, that is very fascinating. And it's interesting because then it leads you to information sharing or intelligence collaboration between other people, right? It leads to intelligence sharing, right? And it leads to the collaboration piece. And doesn't that information from the benchmarking and understanding of where you at versus everybody else start to create data points that are really, when you get it, that's really, really the value, or maybe it's not the most value, but it certainly is an incredibly valuable data point, is once you start to realize these guys are better, I'm not, or I'm better and they are, and start sharing that and collaborating, right? And rising tide lifts all boats type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's two really key bits to what you've just said there. I mean, the first one is the rising tides is all boats, and especially as people start looking at each other and going, oh, gee, that person looks like they're doing a bit better, or how did that person get a bit more money for their ton of grain this year as opposed to me? Yeah, and so you can
Yeah.
see that starting to lift people as they're realizing, well, why I should be doing that as well. And there's always these early movers in any sector, and the land sector is no different, that will really help push that forward. And that's great to see so many of them going there. I think the second part to the question is around that data sharing, which is one of the huge challenges for land. It's a huge, you're dealing with big areas, you're dealing with multiple types of ownership, you're dealing with very complex management and day-to-day data information
Mm.
coming backwards and forwards between groups, and data that for some people they keep it on a notepad in their top pocket, and they've done that for the last 40 years. Other people are using advanced applications. How do you start bringing that data together? And that's actually going to be a really collaborative process. There's not going to be one solution to that. There's agribusinesses that are talking to the farmers and getting information. There's banks that are talking to the farmers to get information from them. There's the farmers themselves that are looking at how do we get better management information? How do we change our practices? They're getting information from advisors like agronomists and other groups. So you've got these, and then you've got all the satellite companies mapping things with these incredible new data sets that are coming out. If we keep doing all of those little things in silos, we're going to go very, very slowly. The secret's going to be how do you stitch all of these together so that you're not collecting data multiple times? Because one of the main aspects of the land sector is the people working on it, farmers, foresters, and others, they are busy people. And their primary purpose is to produce the product that they're trying to produce. And
they're working on slim margins. They're working on very slim margins. And man, their efficiencies, they've got it down. I've dealt with them with agri-plastics, et cetera, and they really want to do it. But if it costs more, slow them down. They can't afford, they won't survive.
Exactly.
To do it.
Exactly. People don't realize just how, one, the margins that a lot of groups are on, and the risk. A lot of these people, you might get 4 years of drought where there's no money coming in, and then you'll get two to three boom years. And those boom years are when you just have to get as much product made and developed as possible off your land. You have to grow as much crop as possible because you know that those next few years are coming down the track. So
you got to stuff that money in a silo.
That's exactly right. And so this is all in my mind about how do you support those groups? This isn't about telling them they need to collect more data. It's how do you actually support them to get more data as part of their daily practice that does not take extra pressure for them. Because if you say it's only 2 days a year to do this, they'll say, well, that's 2 days a year. I don't have 2 days a year. So that's a really interesting challenge. And there's some great companies out there working on that exact problem, actually. How do you start bringing together all of the information from satellites and tractors and farm applications and all of these things to try to get a more coherent picture without actually having to annoy the land managers?
Excellent points. Is there so one of the big points, the will to do this, the infrastructure to do it, the data sharing, the collaboration, all these things are wonderful and stuff. Moving investment capital is key to all of that, right? So what's the UK use case there? This data has got to be tremendous in that application. You have in the United States, that you may be aware that we have, Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals. I'm just kidding. But, we have movement from certain aspects of political arenas where, the ability to utilize public funds for investment in green and sustainable businesses is prohibited. And you can argue that costs taxpayers a lot of money because a lot of these companies are quite profitable. Where does your data fit into that capital, the purse strings, the capital investment to make these things happen?
Yeah, sure. Look, and it's a really key piece of the puzzle because you need the investment to come in because a number of these practices that we're talking about to improve sustainability and land management require changes on land. And that could be something from simple as some new equipment, that can be extraordinarily expensive, simple changes in using different fertilizers. And those different fertilizers might be more expensive than your normal fertilizer, but there could be huge net benefits in using them for the environment and also for other purposes, maybe increases in production, for example. So really from my side, where you're looking at here is you're getting a return on investment. How do you add a couple of percent to that? Because then once you can start saying that, here's a normal investment and here's the sort of internal rate of return you'd expect. But if you do these little few things over the longer term, then you get a couple of extra percent. And over a long time, that's a huge amount of money. So how do you start driving those decisions that may not have huge impacts right now, but really give you that long-term impact, both from a financial perspective, so everyone's doing better, and secondly, from an environment perspective. And that's where we see a lot of our models being really helpful, is that ability to not just say, again, what's happening today, but drive forward on scenarios and say, well, if you did this, then here would be the impact. And you can relate that to production and to financial data at the same time. And you can start trying to make those more informed decisions. Because as you said, a lot of these large groups do have significant capital, but they need the confidence to know where to put it and that the returns will be coming in. And that's, if you don't have that confidence, then it's difficult to make those investments. You'll inherently go and invest in something that you're much more used to, even though the returns might not be as great.
Yeah, it's tremendous. So, last question that I have is, well, I could think of a million, but we're running out of time.
We'll just do another one tomorrow. That's
um,
fine.
yeah. No, we could do one of these every day, and it would be fantastic. Of course, your tomorrow is my 2 days away, right? Your Friday's Friday morning there, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it is. Hopefully, it's a beautiful day. I'm looking forward to it. Uh, the when you start talking about you know uh, the wealth or the value of these things, carbon credits, right, plastic credits, etc. Really interesting. Rack ESG is a company started up here in Iowa, which is fascinating with his human units that he's developing and these type of things to be able to utilize the E, S, and G in ESG for this type of stuff, not just the E or the carbon credit. That there's actually value in social justices and governance, et cetera, that can be done in the same way. Your data, I would suspect, is a key component in this type of thing, or could be used in that area. Correct?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, and we've done a lot with carbon credits and carbon trading over the years. In fact, the Australian system we set up 20 years ago was designed specifically to support carbon markets. It was one of the more interesting aspects of the design.
Very cool.
And really, that sort of piece of one of the challenges is, how do you? Again, it comes back to that question. You need the data to be good enough so that everyone's got the confidence, so that a unit is a unit, and that's really where where that needs to get to. The challenge around the world, of course, is that there's a mix of voluntary markets and compliance markets and semi-markets, and some include the land sector and some don't. And it's all been very challenging for everyone going forward. But I think the measurement piece, especially in the last few years, has progressed so far that a lot of those challenges are now being taken off the table. So where people used to say, oh, well, we can't do the land sector because it's all too hard to measure, or it's all too hard to estimate the emissions and removals from that area, I don't think that's really true anymore. The challenge then comes as to how do you make those markets efficient, and how do you make sure that you have all of the good actors working in there, and that your other policy criteria around additionality and permanence and other issues are all being addressed. So it's been really exciting to see that move forward in that way.
Yeah, I get you. It to me, all of that boils down to this answer. There's a hell of a lot of opportunity.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we just have to grasp
if done right, it can be really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That is fantastic. Rob, what else should we know, brother? What do you got for me? What else should we know, or have I extracted every last bit of intelligence from you?
Oh, look. That's a very good question. I'm not sure myself at this
point. Or have I just beaten you so bad you have no more energy left to give?
Look, no, I mean, my takeaway is that, it's just a really exciting time in land sector information, and it's just exciting to see that the sustainability space has, for the first time in a long time, it feels very sticky, in that we were talking about it before with voluntary commitments. It always felt like there was an up and then it came down, and then there was an up and then it came down. And yes, the general trend was going up a little bit, but things never really stuck. You'd get some legislation and then it would get knocked over, and then you'd get a carbon market and then it would fall over. Then you'd get a voluntary commitments process and it would fall over. And that's a tough environment for anyone to work in when you're trying to drive things forward. But for the last few years, 100%. It's the first time I've really seen where, yes, it's still a bit up and down, that's true, but the trend is really taking off. And when you start seeing governments setting regulations around things like deforestation, sustainability due diligence, all of the work that the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosures is doing and driving this so that companies are starting to think about it and governments are looking at picking it up as part of their reporting processes, suddenly you're turning this into something that just has to become part of day-to-day living. And if you're on a board of a company, then you'll be getting your financial reports, you'll be getting your HR reports, You'll be getting your, other reports, and you'll be getting the sustainability report. And they're all just coming along and you're making
Yeah.
sure they're all ticked off, instead of sustainability being one of those things that appears of, look, we need 2 pages of it in our annual report with a picture of a child holding a tree before they plant it. What we actually need is something that's useful. And that's the exciting piece for me, because you can see that starting to move. So
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I get exactly what you're saying, and that's, I was asked today, a young man is going for his PhD in environmental and sustainability, and he interviewed me as part of his work, and he asked me, why are you a for profit? And it is exactly what you just said, is the sustainability piece is actually good business. It makes no sense to not incorporate it into your business, because you're reducing waste, you're ensuring that your raw materials are going to be there, you're ridding yourself of efficiencies, of inefficiencies, and you're utilizing data, if you're smart, from people like FLINTpro to be able to understand exactly what those impacts are, to validate, to analyze, and to forecast where you're going to be moving into the future. And that's a tremendous thing. I really appreciate what you're doing there, and I love geeking out over data, et cetera, with you. It's been fantastic.
Look, I'm always happy to do it, and I think that point, as you've made probably a bit more clearly than me, this is the exciting thing about FLINTpro. Where I'd love to see FLINTpro being, and what we're driving for, is that a CEO gets their report, they see that the data's been provided by FLINTpro, and they don't question it. They just go, "Yep, that is." We have 100% trust in that. We know that here's where our problems are and here's where we're doing well, and we can go. Otherwise, we're going to end up in another 5 years of everyone arguing about whose data is slightly better, and that's a
Yep.
disaster zone for everyone, and in particular the environment.
It
So,
is.
how do we really get to that point of the confidence? Once you have confidence, you start making decisions, and we really are very happy that we're pushing people towards that feeling.
I love it. So where are people going to check out more? FLINTpro.com, is that it? Or where are we going?
That's the main one, of course, FLINTpro.com. From there, you can see all of our products. You can come in. We can give demonstrations of those, how they work. We have very quick turnarounds on all of those things, a very dedicated team working on all of them. And look, honestly, a lot of really interesting people who've worked in this space 20, 30 years. So if you've got a question around why something is the way it is, then you'll typically find someone in the company has actually worked in that space and can help. So, always reach out through flintpro.com. We're obviously at various conferences and things, and we're all very friendly. So, always happy to chat.
Fantastic. You can also check out Rob on LinkedIn, and you look up Rob Waterworth, and I can assure you there's not a single S in his first or last name. I do not know his middle name, but you don't need that to look him up on LinkedIn. But it's fascinating stuff. Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate this very much. Everybody, hey, thanks for tuning into Sustainiacs. Peace and love.